Welcome to Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace and prosperity in Europe. And this afternoon, I'm very honored to have a very special guest, a civil society activist, a IT entrepreneur, and the curator of the House of Independence of Kosovo, of the museum, the most important museum of Kosovo, Shkumbin Brestovci. I'm very honored to welcome you at the show, and please present yourself to our audience.
Dear Günther, thank you for having me. I'm very glad that your appendicitis surgery in Tirana went well.
Thanks.
I must say, I always admired your positive energy and spirit. We know each other now for a decade or so, and we have been involved in a couple of projects together. Now, I have lived half of my adult life in Pristina and half in Vienna. And I can say that I consider both cities as my hometown. I have studied linguistics at the University of Vienna and worked here. I've been an entrepreneur for more than a decade, but I'm a civil society activist since forever, I think. My favorite topics are technology, open source, and open knowledge, but also civil rights and especially women's rights. As entrepreneur, I actually started with a crazy idea of disrupting the habit of not reading, which is kind of widespread under the millennials. I must say that it didn't go well business-wise, although I never gave up the idea. So in terms of business, I switched to web and technology, specifically software development, but I kind of always continued to preach and motivate people to read. One of the most beautiful moments in the web business was when one of the designers came to me and said, "You have a spelling error in the text that you gave me." I was like, you read what I wrote? You didn't just shovel the letters into the text block? I have somehow motivated a designer to read what he was layouting. It was amazing. Some 6 years ago, I left the company that I founded. The company was Rota. You visited us a couple of times there. And I dedicated myself to two projects. One was digitizing books published in Kosovo. This was done through FLOSK, Free Libre Open Source Software Kosovo, which is one of the rare, truly grassroots NGOs in Kosovo. Founded in 2009 by my friend James Michael Dupont. And I was one of the co-founders, which I'm actually very proud of. The other project was the Museum of Independence.
That's a very special. That's a very special Museum of Independence. It's the house of Ibrahim Rugova, the national holy place of the Republic of Kosovo in many ways. And you decided to be the curator of the relaunch of this important museum. Can you maybe explain a bit the setting and the building itself and how it is actually, how the whole story of this building came about?
Well, that was the office of, actually the office of it is a barrack. It's a very small office. It was the office of Kosovo Film first. But then every expat in Kosovo knows that the film, where the film city is, and the Kosovo Film got this big house, which is now the film city. So in 1988, this small barrack was given to the Writers Associations of Kosovo. It was also the year when Ibrahim Rugova was elected the president of the Writers Association. Now, the 80s in Kosovo were quite terrible, not as terrible as the 90s, but also very much so. Since 1981, when these riots happened, almost 600,000 Kosovars during the 80s, it means half of the adult population were arrested, interrogated, interned, and reprimanded. There was a huge and orchestrated campaign of dehumanization of Albanians going on in Serbia. There is actually a very good book on propaganda, which deals also with this part, written by Mark Thompson, Forging War. So this orchestrated propaganda just changed the subject in 1991 and targeted the Croats and soon after the Bosniaks. Now, with Milosevic's grip on power, the abolition of autonomy of Kosovo and the very obvious warmongering of the Serbian authorities, Kosovo responded with non-violence. In December 1989, the LDK was founded, and by May the next year, it counted 700,000 members. It was actually the most massive support by far, also compared to other parties in Yugoslavia. And it was actually the only one sincerely determined to pursue a non-violent way of achieving political goals.
And the building, the House of Independence, was in a way the parliament or the headquarters of LDK. What was the role of the building?
This building was the headquarters of LDK. Actually, it was at the second elections, it was also the House of Parliament.
And it was the center of the resistance, of the peaceful resistance.
It was absolutely the center of the resistance. Everything went through it.
Good. It's very symbolic place, and you decided to help this museum for the relaunch, to explain the Kosovo narrative, the Kosovo history better to international visitors. I think you had a visitor yourself, and you decided somehow on the occasion of showing this museum to relaunch the museum exhibition.
Yeah, so actually it happened that a very good friend of mine was visiting Pristina for the first time. I think it was around 2015. And I showed her around and wanted to tell her also about the nonviolent resistance. So I brought her to the Museum of Independence. And I noticed that the story was actually not being told in the museum. So I pitched the project to the Ministry of Culture, which is like the institution which still centrally controls the museums and other cultural institutions. And it took like a year and a half until they got back to me. Since then, I have dedicated over 3 years of research, and I'm until now, today, still researching and reading publications and papers, which are a lot on the topic of Kosovo, although not particularly dealing with the nonviolent resistance. Most of the research is on like coercive diplomacy and NATO intervention, because that was kind of a big deal that went through the media. But I find that considering the violent breakup of Yugoslavia and the wars, this singular but very large nonviolent phenomenon has gained little attention. Actually, it is being unfairly downplayed as not so important. I think this sends also a wrong signal that only violence can achieve goals, which is actually proven to be false. There is a study by Erika Chenovet, who compared all resurgence, violent and non-violent, through the whole 20th century. And she has proven that the non-violent ones were by 60% more successful. That means 2 out of 3 successful resurgences are not violent empirically. So the Kosovar non-violent resistance is definitely a beautiful story in the rather crazy and bloody Balkans. I think it's a story worth telling to the world.
Absolutely, and especially because it's the house of Ibrahim Rugova, the creator of the First Republic and the hero of peaceful resistance. It's very important to have this very excellent exhibition devoted to him at this very special place. Thanks a lot for that one. We have decided to go then into the, unfortunately, the very bloody part of the history of Kosovo, because in order to explain the whole history, it's important to also explain the context of the Balkan history. And it was now it's also the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo. And the new prime minister of Kosovo has raised a lot of eyebrows with asking Serbia to apologize for 3 different genocides, which were committed by Serbia against the Kosovo Albanians. And obviously, many people don't understand exactly the context. And so we decided to make this interview also to start in the big question about the settlement of the Great Eastern Crisis of 1875 to 1878. And we will start now this interview about Kosovo history with exactly that major confrontation between Russia and Turkey, which was tearing the Balkan apart. And it was in the year 1878 with the Berlin Congress, and it led to territories being gained by Serbia. And this is basically the moment where the first genocide happened. Shkumbin, can you outline a little bit the perspective of the Kosovo Albanians on the Great Eastern Crisis and what happened to your people in the years after it?
Well, I dealt with this in the museum, so actually one part of the exhibition is dedicated to the history. So because I assumed it would be of interest for the visitors to know how we got there. I based this almost entirely on the book of Noel Malcolm, Kosovo: A Short History, but also on an illustrated brochure published by the Belgrade Helsinki Federation. As you say, during the Eastern Crisis, Serbia gained its independence and started its expansion. So during the Russian-Ottoman Wars, it annexed Sanjak of Niš, which was largely populated by Albanians. One might call this campaign a genocidal one, since no Albanian was left to live there. A lot of Albanians were killed and the rest were expelled. The territory was ethnically cleansed thoroughly. Actually, every second Kosovar that one asked has at least one ancestor from these muhajirs that were expelled by Serbian forces in 1878. Still, genocide is a very serious crime and it really should not be used that easily. Actually, the Albanian response to the Eastern Crisis was the League of Prizren, where the leaders from all 4 Albanian inhabited vilayets, Janina, Monastir, Kosovo, and Shkodra, got together in June 1878 and requested autonomy for the Albanian vilayets. At least since then, it was obvious that Kosovo was just as important to Albanians as it is claimed by the Serbs.
That is this period after the Berlin Congress is the first genocidal period. The second one started then with the Young Turk revolution in 1908. There were several revolutions and rebellions of the Albanians against the Ottoman Empire. And in 1912, there started the first Balkan Wars in 1912. And I think in October, it was then when present-day territory of Kosovo was occupied then by Serbia. And then very serious genocidal activities started again from the Serbian, they called themselves liberators, but for the people living in that territory, obviously very terrible times started. Can you outline this second period of disaster which struck the Albanians in 1912 to 1915?
Yes, it was very bad indeed. The plight of Albanians caused by the Serbian annexation was also very well documented, as were the whole proceedings of the Balkan Wars. You had the famous Russian activist Leon Trotsky reporting from the site, but also the report of the independent Carnegie Foundation. It was then that the phrase Balkan atrocities was coined, which haunted the Balkans ever since, until the recent breakup of Yugoslavia. Again, it was bad, it was bloody, but actually at this time, the only massive killing that qualifies as genocide is the one committed by Turkey against the Armenians, since they left no Christian alive in Anatolia. Lots of Kosovars survived the Serbian terror, so I guess it will be hard to prove the genocide. But certainly there was a genocidal intention, no doubt about that. The curious thing about the Balkan War is that it was initiated by the Kosovar insurgents led by Hasan Prishtina, who was a Kosovar deputy in the Ottoman parliament. He attacked the Ottoman authorities and claimed independence for Albania. They actually managed to liberate Skopje, the capital of Northern Macedonia now, which was at that time the capital of the Kosovo Vilayet. And Shkup was also meant to be the capital of the independent Albania. This incident actually accelerated the events as the Balkan allies, Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia, urged a couple of months later, as you said, in October, to start their campaigns against the Ottoman Empire because they feared that Albania would gain independence and would jeopardize their expansion plans.
At this time, in October, November 1912, it was the Serbian forces already in Durrës, and so the situation looked very bleak for the Albanians.
Yeah, it was, and also South Albania was occupied by the Greek troops. So the only part that was actually free was around Vlora, where the independence of Albania was proclaimed, as you know.
That was on the 28th of November 1912, the foundation moment of the Albanian state. And it was a very shaky and difficult moment still. But then came the Austrian ultimatum to withdraw for Serbia to withdraw from Albania. Why actually was Albania not? Why was Kosovo not included in that ultimatum? Why was there this kind of present borders as the denomination?
Well, it's a long story actually, because the diplomatic efforts came from everywhere, and actually the Serbian diplomatic efforts were stronger than the Albanian ones, so they managed to hold of their annexation of Kosovo. On the Albanian side, it was actually only Austria in their side, you know.
So Austria was vital to have independence of Albania recognized in 1912.
Absolutely.
And then came the First World War, and the situation was also very dramatic. How was the situation of Kosovo Albanians in the First World War?
Well, yeah, but it was not good. It was actually a state of terror, a permanent expulsion and colonization. Lots of Albanians were expelled during this time to Turkey. I'm not going to go into figures because they are still subject of dispute, and frankly, I don't think it's of such importance. The SHS, the Kingdom of Serbs and Croats and Slovenians, did not recognize any minority rights, and especially not the minority rights of Albanians. There were no Albanian schools, no newspapers, nothing. Authorities confiscated land from the Albanians and gave it to Serbian settlers. The so-called colonization was at the highest peak during this time.
That was in the time in the interwar period, after 1920, when Yugoslavia was established in 1918, and also then Albania was re-established after 1920, when it was able to fend off Serbian and Greek and Italian pretensions. And so the interwar years were also very difficult for the Kosovo Albanians.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was talking about. The war period was actually, you know, a mixed one, because it was also, let's say, liberated by Austria at one piece of time. So it was kind of turned back. The atrocities were also from Albanian side to the Serbian side in this time. So actually there was always a spiral of violence, which I tend not to deny, although maybe many Albanians would deny it, as many Serbians deny their own. But the only difference is that the Serbian violence was organized by the state, as the Albanian violence was actually a retaliation by people who had suffered, you know.
That was the 20 years of the interwar period. And then started the Second World War with the Italian invasion of Albania and then later Greece, and also then 41, the Nazi attack on Yugoslavia. How was the situation during the Second World War in Kosovo?
Well, actually, there was not much of war going on in the Balkans, not as much as the states pretend, because it's kind of a myth created by the partisans who got into power after the war, that they pretended they were actually fighting. They were not actually fighting. Most of Kosovo became part of Albania under the Italian occupation and afterwards under the Germans. The authorities opened lots of schools throughout Kosovo, and it was the first time that happened, actually. The Kosovars actually perceived this as a liberation. As I said, there were also some retaliations committed, especially against Serbian settlers, the colonizers. Yeah, as I mentioned, the Serbian ones previously were organized and sponsored by the state, and the ones committed by the Albanians were rather retaliations by people who had suffered previously.
The Albanians and also the Kosovo Albanians are world famous also for helping the Jews during the World War II. And recently there was a site devoted in Israel, in Yad Vashem, for the righteous of nations to acknowledge also the support for Jews and the saving of Jews during the Holocaust. Can you explain a bit the role of Albanians and Jews in helping them?
Yes, I can say that actually there was no massive fascist or national socialistic organization in Albania or in Kosovo. There was basically none. The people actually didn't understand the ideology behind it. You can also see that in the case of Bali Komtar, which was later on declared as the collaborated, which they were not. It was actually a democratic organization, but they needed a collaborator, so the communists said this was Bali Komtar. Yeah, as you said, Albanians saved and protected the Jews, although they actually couldn't save the most important linguist, Norbert Jokel, a Viennese Jew who was waiting for his Albanian passport, but he was deported to a concentration camp before he received it.
Very terrible destiny.
Yeah.
Then came the year 44, and the partisans, supported by the Allies, by the British, and also later then the Soviets, have liberated the Balkans and won the Second World War. But how was the period from 44 to 48 then for Kosovo Albanians?
Yeah, actually there was some resistance in Kosovo against the Yugoslavian, actually the Serbian communists, and it was crushed with utmost cruelty. It was actually a reign of secret service terror in whole of territory of Yugoslavia, but in Kosovo it was carried out with much more cruelty, with raids in private homes, searching for weapons and expulsions. The old agreement with Turkey to expel Albanians was continued, and even Tito has made a new one with the foreign minister of Turkey, which was carried on especially in the 50s. Tito's breakup with Stalin and in 1948 sealed the border with Albania, and lots of families were torn apart, never being able to visit their relatives.
This period from 48, from the split with the Soviet Union, with Stalin, until the 66 is called the Rankovic period in Kosovo. Can you explain what was the Rankovic period and how were the living conditions of Kosovo Albanians?
Yes, this is the reign of terror, and it carries the name of Alexander Rankovic, who was the interior minister and the chief of Yugoslav Secret Service, UDBA. Rankovic was actually the second man after Tito and was notorious for his cruel methods and for insisting in the centralized power as opposed to other communists at that time who were inclined to decentralization of the power, meaning more power to the republics, less central power in Belgrade. And Rankovic was really notorious, and the most pressure and the most terror was actually executed in Kosovo.
In 1966 was the fall of Rankovic. It came in the context also of the Yugoslavian state being in the first major currency crisis and bankruptcy. And so there was a kind of softening up of the Yugoslavian state because they accepted much American funding from 1966 onwards. Yeah? And so how the situation changed then after 66 until the death of Tito in that period?
It actually changed radically. It was the time when Kosovo gained its autonomy and the University of Pristina was established. It was a time of progress for Kosovo, although it still actually remained the poorest part of Yugoslavia, and still the main positions in the province were held by Serbs, and their representation both in terms of employment and in high positions were far higher than their proportion in the population. But certainly the Serbs felt threatened because they started losing privileges and the absolute power they used to exercise.
This was also the period when Austria and Germany opened the labor market for Yugoslavian citizens. And was it also allowed for Kosovo Albanians to get some of the quota places to migrate and to send remittances?
Yes, at this time, there were not many, but quite a few Albanians also left for Austria and Germany and Western countries to work there.
In 1980, then Tito died. And what was the perception of Tito in Kosovo at the time?
Well, the perception of Tito was a mixed one, but I wouldn't like really to go into it because the death of Tito meant something else actually. While nationalism was always part of the Yugoslav debates and controversies, although it was held in check exactly by Tito. Actually, everybody feared or knew that after Tito's death, it was going to erupt again. The Serbian nationalists utilized the student protests of 1981 to paint a picture of an Albanian separatist, irredentist danger, and they worked very hard and intense to make it the only debate throughout the whole decade of the 80s. I mean, the country was a wreck economically, but everybody was talking only about the danger of the Albanian nationalism. In September 1986, a memorandum written in the Serbian Academy of Science was leaked to a newspaper, and it talked about the unsolved Serbian question. But it hinted that Serbian people were not only endangered in Kosovo, but also elsewhere in Yugoslavia, especially in Croatia and Bosnia.
You were mentioning that the situation in Yugoslavia was more and more getting unsustainable. There was also the Olympic Games in '84, and then later also the financial crisis of Yugoslavia was leading to everybody speculating about a big fiscal collapse in '84 and '85. And this probably led also to a reinforcement of nationalism in '86 with the memorandum.
Exactly, yeah. Because not dealing with the economic problems, but dealing with a nationalism, with painting pictures of enemies, was actually where it led the whole country.
And then came this, in a way, negatively, historically, a visit of Milosevic in '87 to Kosovo Polje, to Fush Kosovo, where he made this kind of alliance with the Kosovo Serbs and used them as a tool to gain power in this inner Yugoslavian power struggle which followed.
Yeah, Milosevic's word in Fush Kosovo in 1987, "No one will dare to beat you," designated him as the leader who would carry out the program drafted in the memorandum of SANU, of the Academy of Science of Serbia. He carried out the so-called anti-bureaucratic revolution, took power in the Serbian League of Communists by removing his political godfather Ivan Stambolic and the Belgrade communist leader Dragiša Pavlović. using the mobs in the so-called meetings of truth to overthrow the government of Vojvodina and Montenegro and install in them his loyal henchmen. It culminated with the abolition of the autonomy of Kosovo in February 1989, where the voting in the Kosovo parliament was held under extreme pressure, with tanks surrounding the parliament building and non-members voting inside. This coup d'etat has secured Milosevic 4 of the 8 votes in the Yugoslav Federation. So he was basically controlling the whole Yugoslav Federation.
And then he came to celebrate his victory towards the 600 year celebration in Kosovo in June at Vidovdan on the 28th of June in 89.
Right. Yes, the ceremony of the 600 years anniversary of the mythological Battle of Kosovo was an expression of Serbian nationalism. It was also the biggest and the last meeting in the series of meetings of truth. There, Milosevic said literally, 6 centuries later, now we are being again engaged in battles and are facing battles. They are not armed battles, although such things cannot be excluded yet. This was later on interpreted as his declaration of war.
This was the year of peace in Europe, where communism fell and Eastern Europe was opening, and it was the end of the Warsaw Pact and of peaceful unification of Europe started. But unfortunately, Milosevic in the same year declared war on the rest of Yugoslavia in June 89, and he lived up to his challenge. In 1990, then the year after, on the 2nd of July, Kosovo declared a republic inside Yugoslavia. How did that come along?
Yes, also, so the legal representatives of Kosovo, members of parliament, declared the status of Kosovo as the 7th republic of the Yugoslav Federation. They voted and promulgated the law in all legality. This is important because the whole legal battle of the non-violent resistance was based on this legal continuity.
So that was on the 2nd of July 1990.
Right.
And on September 1990, only 2 months later, there was the Constitution of Kochare announced.
Yeah, it was a further step. So the same legal members of parliament voted and promulgated the Constitution on the 7th of September 1990. They met in secrecy because they had no control of police. It was controlled centrally by Belgrade. In this regard, it was a symbolic gesture, but it helped to build a cohesion and legality of the non-violent resistance. That is why it was and still is very important.
Then the next year came the year of the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Declaration of Independence. We have now 30 years. In 2021, it's exactly 30 years. First Slovenia, then the Slovenian 10 Days War in June 91, and then the Croatian independence, and in November also then the Vukovar, the real escalation of the war. And in this context, there was Macedonian Declaration of Independence on the 8th of September and 1991. And also on the 22nd of September, there was the first Kosovo independence referendum and the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
How did that come along?
So actually, the same parliament declared the law on referendum right after the Croatia and Slovenia did that, and the referendum was held in September 1991, and it was of course answered with a yes from the Kosovo population by over a 90, I think 5%.
So all people who participated, they have voted yes, basically, on that.
Yes.
And it was, let me ask you also, Shkumbin, why is it not today, for example, the Second Republic? Because that was the First Republic declared, and it had also the backing of the people.
Why didn't answer?
Because we in Austria, we have the Second Republic in a way, but Kosovo has not really chosen to go into First Republic, Second Republic.
Well, it it actually is very important day for Kosovo. So actually, it is recognized by Kosovars as the First Republic, so to say.
Good. So then my question is, only Albania recognized it, then the only other state, yeah? Why did the international community recognize Macedonian independence, which was declared just 2 weeks before, and didn't recognize Kosovo independence?
Well, the problem was that the international community was confused with the whole Yugoslavia thing, and they all actually were having big discussions to even recognize Slovenia and Croatia. But that happened at some point after the whole war thing started. And with Kosovo being actually in kind of peace, it was downplayed as maybe safe for now. So that's why only Albania recognized the independence of Kosovo.
On the next year, on the 1st of March 92, it was Bosnia to declare independence, and then started also then the next days in March, and then in April 92 started the Bosnian War until 95. What was the situation in Kosovo during the Bosnian War?
Well, I have to tell you a curiosity. It was during the whole 90s, Kosovo was a state of occupation and apartheid. And the curiosity is actually that the Serbian authorities were trying very hard to provoke a war in Kosovo. They actually, in January 1991, before the war started in Croatia, Ratko Mladic was stationed in the army corpus of Pristina. And there was a real effort to start the war in Kosovo at the same time as in Croatia. As it apparently did not happen because of the Kosovar commitment to non-violent resistance, 6 months later, Mladic was sent to Knin in Croatia, where he could be more useful.
There was also a debate, some people talk about the Southern Front to also have a war.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
And do you think that there was an effort from the Kosovo Albanians to create the Southern Front, or it was more the wish from the Serbians?
There was some, I mean, there was some, but the efforts came mainly from Serbia and partly from Croatia.
Good.
So this stationing of Ratko Mladic in January 1991 tells all about it. So they were actually prepared to start the war in Kosovo in January 1991.
President Rugova was committed for peaceful resistance?
Yes. And the whole movement, actually.
What was his thinking? What was his role models? What was his kind of idea about winning peacefully?
It was, I mean, we can talk days about that, but basically he was realistic in terms of that the Albanians cannot fight a war with nothing, with no weapons, whereas the Serbian army actually inherited all the weapons of the Yugoslav army, which was, as people say, the fourth army in Europe, the fourth strongest army in Europe. So we couldn't stand a day, so to say, in the war.
Can you describe, because often the Kosovo Albanians use the word apartheid for the 1990s. Can you describe the living conditions, and is the term apartheid justified for describing the 1990 situations of Kosovo Albanians?
Well, Albanians were expelled from jobs, were expelled from all institutions, from schools, from hospitals. They were actually expelled from every social life. So I'm inclined to quote here Professor Ashraf Ademai, one of the professors leading the resistance against apartheid, who said that we are the university, we are the institutions, us teachers and students, not the buildings. So we will continue our work no matter in what building. So actually that was kind of the trigger that the work was carried out as usual, but outside of the physical buildings. In this regard, the denunciation of parallel education system, which is used, I think it's quite misleading, because it was the regular one being held outside of the buildings, which were occupied by the Serbian regime. This actually, as I told you, happened in every institution. Buildings were occupied by Serbian authorities. And what I actually also deal in the exhibition, the most amazing one that I think was the health service, because it was very hard to organize. The Albanian doctors and the medical staff were fired from the state hospitals, but it was at the same time that private clinics were allowed to be established. So most of the Albanian doctors opened private clinics, which were of course not affordable for most of the Kosovars. Under these circumstances, to organize a free health system, to open 96 clinics in all parts of Kosovo, I think it deserves special recognition. It was an amazing feature of the Kosovar nonviolent resistance.
Absolutely. It was very terrible times, but also it showed the cohesiveness of the Kosovo Albanian society to be able to organize education and health outside of the buildings occupied by the Yugoslavian authorities.
With no state support, so it was actually also financed by Albanians themselves, not only buildings.
Let me ask you about the end of the Bosnian War, the Dayton Agreement, and the effect this had on Kosovo.
Yeah, after the Dayton Agreement, where the war in Croatia and Bosnia was brought to an end, there was no mention of Kosovo. It looked like everything was settled and Milosevic remained in power and was even praised as a peace broker. Some Kosovars took this as a signal that nonviolent resistance is not going to bring anything, and that nothing is gained without war. I don't share that opinion, because actually Montenegro became independent without war, although everybody actually anticipated the next war in Montenegro. Anyways, to look back in 1997, Serbia was shaken by a wave of protests against Milosevic, who lost his power in the municipal elections. And it was obvious, as Tim Judah put it, that he would need to start a new war in order to remain in power.
There was this famous student protest. I was personally also present, where they were closer to toppling, hopefully, but it didn't work out, unfortunately. History would have been very different. 97 was also the year where Montenegro turned away from Milosevic.
Exactly.
And also 97 was the year of the revolution in Albania. How did this all affect then the start of the Kosovo Independence War in 97?
Yeah, well, the war didn't start actually in 97. There were some actions by the KLA and some small retaliations by the Serbian forces, but the whole thing changed in March 1998 with Breakup. So actually there is a very good, accurate description of what happened in Breakup in March 1998 in the Kosovo memory book by the Belgrade-based Humanitarian Law Center. The regime in Belgrade sent 3 different special units under the command of Yugoslav, or rather Serbian Ministry of Interior, with tanks and heavy weaponry against this Albanian village. So there was the police special units, PGP in Serbian, SAJ, Special Anti-Terrorist Units, and JSO, Units for Special Operations of the Serbian Secret Service, SDB. They had the order not to let anyone alive get in or out of the village. This actually happened just after the American ambassador Gelbart declared that KLA was a terrorist organization. And I think this kind of gave Milosevic an excuse to crack down.
It was a terrible massacre on this infamous day of the 5th of March in
Absolutely.
98.
Children were killed, old women, everybody in the village was killed.
I hope one day also leading European politicians will visit the Breakup memorial site in order also to pay respect for the victims of that genocidal action. That was in March 98, and then there was Breakup, and then was already the war starting gradually. There was the first battle of Kochare, that's at the border between Albania and Kosovo. And how did the first period until the summer 98 go between the Yugoslavian army and UČK?
Oh, well, that was this period where the international community was very much engaged in finding a solution. And they managed, after the crackdown of the Serbian military in the summer, to force Milosevic to back off some of his troops from Kosovo, and they engaged also the diplomatic bulldozer Holbrook to put pressure on all actually parts, and they sent also the Kosovo verification mission. But when they asked Milosevic, Holbrook also said nobody asked anything from KLA, so they used the vacuum and led, which remained by the retreat of the Serbian forces.
There was the famous visit of Ambassador Holbrook to Kosovo. I think it was in the summer of 98. And then he looked to establish contacts towards the UČK leadership. And so gradually there was this armistice then in the late summer 98, starting, I think, to October.
No, that was a crackdown. And then afterwards, after the crackdown, actually, the efforts of the international community and especially Holbrooks brought Milosevic to pull out some troops from Kosovo, which happened then in December, basically in November, December 1998.
In December 98, there was also this tragic panda coffee killing, where recently it was found out that the Serbian Secret Service UDBA has itself committed this terrible crime.
Yes. I think there were lots of incidents like this, and it deserves basically a special study to point out all of the UDBA actions to confuse and render excuses for their planned reprisals.
So they created the incidents and then they vowed revenge and retaliatory actions against their own incidents they have committed.
Right.
Terrible. In the winter of 99, then on the 15th of January, and there came the attack on the village of Račak. And here, that was a really terrible crime. Can you explain what happened on this infamous 15th of January?
Yeah, I think Milosevic was actually pushing hard towards a war because he knew that the international community was divided, and he counted on the possibility to exploit that division to stay in power. Actually, many Serbs point this out as a critique to the international community, saying that the international community, gave us not choice but to rally behind Milosevic.
No, yeah, okay, but nevertheless, let's discuss what happened exactly on the 15th of January, because it was a terrible massacre, and it was in a way the start of the third genocide, which Mr. Kurti has declared. And so it's very important to understand for the viewers what exactly happened on the 15th of January in Rajak and that infamous day.
Yes, it was actually the excuse that international community was waiting. It was a very terrible massacre where the Serbian forces killed villagers in Rajak. I don't know the figure now how many, but it was a big one. And the next day it was visited by the American ambassador. What's his name again?
Walker.
Pardon?
Walker.
Walker, exactly. So, and Walker actually declared it as a massacre, and it was exactly the excuse that international community was waiting to put Milosevic under pressure and have him deal with a compromise in Rambouillet afterwards.
That was on the 15th of January. That was then the start of the third genocidal campaign of Serbia after 1878 and 1912. And this is now the third phase where massive violence was used against the population by the Serbian state. And this has started on the, it was already in 98 very wild, but in 99 on the 15th of January was the Rajak massacre, right, the start of it. And then, of course, there were really very serious talks with Milosevic to accept autonomy and some kind of new status for Kosovo. Can you explain this effort which led then to Rambouillet?
Yeah, I mean, there was Milosevic did something in the meantime, that he actually held a referendum in Serbia and asked the Serbian people whether they are in favor of letting the international community decide about Kosovo, and the answer was no. So he had the excuse that you cannot have a say in an internal matter of Serbia. But of course, after the massacres and the whole reprisals, the international community was not satisfied, so they organized a conference in Rambouillet to bring the parties together and so to say, to force a deal between them. The deal was refused by the Serbian authorities, and it was actually also very hardly signed by the Kosovar delegation because it didn't have the word independence, and which were very important, was very important for the Kosovo part.
This is now the first part of this interview. We have covered 1 hour. We covered the history from the first to the third genocide. And in the second part of the interview, we will discuss then from Rambouillet towards liberation, and we will cover the period of the war. In the third part, we will cover then the period from the liberation 99 to independence of the Second Republic in 2008. And then in the fourth part, I'm correct in the counting, yes, we will cover then the history, which is also part of the Museum of Independence of the new republic born 2008 and to now. That is our plan, but we decided not to make one interview with 4 hours because maybe that's a bit too long, but to have one first interview with the curator of the Museum of Independence for Ibrahim Rugova, the hero of peaceful resistance in the 90s and the creator of the First Republic and the first president of Kosovo also after liberation, who passed away too early in January 2006. And his museum is a very important memorial site of European significance, which I think every European has to see. And it was a great honor to talk with the curator of this amazing museum. And I hope there will be many, many tourists and many people interested in history of Kosovo to see this video, but also to see the real thing in the House of Independence in Kosovo. And Shkumbin Brestovci, I want to thank you for your effort to curate and to relaunch this museum. And also thank you for your effort for this interview, for your time, and also for your knowledge about this first phase leading to 99 of Kosovo history and your perspectives on that one. Thanks for coming to Pax Europiana, to the show for peace and prosperity in Europe. Shkumbin, final words.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot for that.
It's always a pleasure.
More to come. It's 4 series. We will do more.
Looking forward.
Or maybe 5. Thanks a lot. I will stop recording now. 1 second.